last but not least, our third paper comes from Ivan Milanov, senior professor in Old Testament at Newbold College in the UK. His paper is entitled Indecent Proposal, the Rabashak's Speech and Divine Response in Isaiah 36 to 37.
The Rabshakeh's speech in Isaiah 36 and King Sennacherib's letter in the following chapter are masterpieces of rhetorics. By combining mockery, military facts, and theological interpretation of recent victories of the king of Assyria, the Rabshakeh and the subsequent letter of Sennacherib advance a series of arguments why King Hezekiah and the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem should surrender to the king of Assyria, and at the same time become his subjects. Isaiah 36 and 37 presents two speeches of the Rabshakeh, Isaiah 36, 4 to 12, and Isaiah 36, 13 to 20, and one letter addressed to King Hezekiah in Isaiah 37, 10 to 13. The speech and the letter end with a theological statement that indicates either God's approval for the Assyrian invasion on Judah and its success, like is Isaiah 36:10, or it implies that King of Assyria is more powerful than God of Israel, Isaiah 36:20 and 37:12. On the other hand, the reaction of the representatives of King Hezekiah and his own reaction to the Rabshakeh speech and the king's letter are certainly of distress and trauma. Finally, it seems that the divine response through the prophet Isaiah results in deliverance of Judah from the Assyrian threat and the death of its king. The purpose of this presentation is to exegete the speeches of the Rabshakeh and the letter of King of Assyria and the divine response through the lens of trauma reading. Trauma reading provides an interpreter with an exegetical focus rather than presenting a fully fledged interpretative method. It is actually a reading strategy that centers on the experience of extensive suffering of the characters in the biblical text. Particularly, it exposes the features of trauma experienced in the text that would have been overlooked if another reading strategy had been employed. A hermeneutical analogy of ultraviolet flashlight would be very useful at this point. An interpreter could unearth certain features of the text that are illuminated by the trauma reading strategy. According to Lee, it provides a fresh angle to interpret biblical texts, particularly those describing traumatic events. This is exactly what will be the initial point from which the trauma reading will commence towards more detailed interpretation of Isaiah 36 and 37. Therefore, I employ an eclectic method of interpretation of Isaiah 36 and 37 that has the following hermeneutical assumptions as its foundation. First, I approach the book of Isaiah in its final form as presented in the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible. Secondly, I consider it a carefully composed piece of literature in the form of a single narrative intersected with poetic sections, the Rabshakeh speech, the letter of Sennacherib, and the prophecy uttered by prophet Isaiah. This assumption enables me to employ the interpretative tools of narrative criticism. Third, I regard the book of Isaiah as part of the canon of the Hebrew Bible, so I will utilize the intertextual insight from text employing the same terminology found in other books like concepts and ideas. In conclusion, I will apply the trauma reading of Isaiah 36 and 37 in relation to the narrative criticism and intertextuality as an interpretative framework to draw theological implications from such a reading strategy. Thus, the trauma-informed reading of this position of Isaiah is primarily literary and theological, and less psychological. There has been scholarly consensus that the effectiveness of the trauma reading depends on the implementation of the following elements. Number one, the definition of trauma affects how an interpreter utilizes trauma reading and what features of the text will be the focus of such interpretation. The word trauma is of Greek origin, meaning wound. According to trauma theory, trauma is a disturbing experience that mentally overwhelms an individual, called survivor, or community, survivors, making them unable to respond to the usual defending mechanisms that help them to cope and adjust. The inflicted trauma is an unhealed mental wound that festers because the survivor has no cognitive frame of reference for treating the trauma. Second, the survivor's first response is an attempt to make a sense of the trauma narrative. But the issue is that the inflicted trauma shatters the established cognitive frame of reference. Trauma, more particularly, shatters the established worldview and fundamental beliefs, which are the foundational cognitive framework for interpreting the reality. Thus, the trauma experience remains outside of the established interpretative framework. However, the destructiveness of the trauma does not stop here, but it replaces the established interpretative framework with a toxic one that becomes permanent and generates harmful thoughts and negative emotions. The toxic interpretative framework includes core beliefs about self as abundant and worthless, and a perception of God that is either apathetic or cruel. The survivor, hence, is unable to make sense of the trauma experience, not only due to the collapsed explanatory frame, but they continue reliving the trauma by interpreting the reality according to the new but toxic framework that is now in place. Such characteristics of trauma reading prompts me to recognize certain elements in Isaiah 36 and 37 that serve as shutters of the established interpretative framework and to discover the prospective recovery strategy in the text itself. The latter is very important because the toxic explanatory framework should be replaced by a meaningful one that only can prevent similar events in the future to inflict new trauma. The final element of the trauma reading in Isaiah 36 and 37 is to recognize the individual and collective aspects of trauma and ways of recovery. The speech of the Rabshakeh and the letter of King Sennacherib do not inflict trauma only to King Hezekiah, but they traumatically affect his advisors as well. Furthermore, the involvement of Prophet Isaiah in the recovery strategy indicates that the trauma reading deals with the collective trauma. According to Balaev, linking the individual and collective trauma has an effect on the collective memory and identity of the community facing the trauma. Inflicting the trauma by the Rabshakeh speeches and King Sennacherib's letter. The application of trauma reading strategy to these two chapters at this stage includes the following elements: to recognize the elements of trauma-caused behavior, to analyze the rhetorical strategy of the Rabshakeh speech and King Sennacherib's letter as shattering blows to the established interpretative framework of King Hezekiah and his administrators. And secondly, to understand the toxicity of the replacement interpretative framework offered to King Hezekiah in the speech of the Rabshakeh and the letter of King Sennacherib. The shutters delivered by the Rabshakeh. The Rabshakeh is actually a title that comes from the Akkadian Rabshakeh, which means chief cupbearer. He was a highly positioned imperial officer, serving either as spokesman or even as a prime minister to the Assyrian king. He, in the text, delivers a rhetorical masterpiece, but in its core, it's arrogant and blasphemous. The rhetorical strategy of the Rabshakeh in verses 4 to 10 in Isaiah 36 are the following. Speaking in the language of Judah, in order to cause a panic among the inhabitants of Jerusalem and potential rebellion against King Hezekiah. Secondly, using an introductory formula at the beginning of his speech, "Thus says the king," that resembles closely the prophetic formula. The speech moves from categorization of Judah's political alliance with Egypt as both useless and harmful, to the lack of skillful chariot drivers, to the claim that the Lord has commanded the king of Assyria to wage a war against Judah and to destroy it. The Rabshakeh attempts to shatter both the political, horizontal, and religious, vertical foundational elements of the established cognitive framework of King Hezekiah, his negotiators, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. The purpose of these shatters is to inflict trauma and impose an interpretation, or better said, an ultimatum, that the situation is hopeless. No human or divine help will come to the rescue. Egypt is useless and harmful, and the Lord is on the Syrian side. That's the essence of the Rabshakeh speech. The second speech of the Rabshakeh surpasses the first one in arrogance and blasphemy. The speech is initially directed to shattering the trustworthiness of King Hezekiah as the main campaigner for relying on the Lord as their deliverer from the Assyrian threat. By doing so, the Rabshakeh attempts to replace the Lord with the Assyrian king. Sennacherib is presented as superior to the gods of the already conquered nations, and this implies the same outcome as expected with the kingdom of Judah, making Sennacherib even superior to the Lord. The same notion is further enforced by Sennacherib's letter. The difference in the Sennacherib letter and the Rabshakeh speech is that in the Sennacherib letter, now the Lord, not King Hezekiah, is portrayed as the source of this deceitful promise to protect the inhabitants of Jerusalem from the imminent Assyrian conquest. The letter elaborates the classification of God as one who deceives his people by arguing from the portfolio of victories of Sennacherib over various nations. So the main rationale of this letter is that if gods of the conquered kings and lands could not protect their worshippers from Sennacherib, then the God of Judah will not be able to protect his people either. Moreover, the Rabshakeh presents the Assyrian king's offer or promise of new fertile land to the inhabitants of Jerusalem in terms that resembles Lord's covenantal promise of land to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their descendants, including the current inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. As the Lord promised fertile land of plenty as part of the covenant, according to Exodus, the book of Numbers, Deuteronomy, similar offer or promise is directed to the Lord's people if they submit to the king of Assyria. The king of Assyria promised the land of grain and wine, the land of bread and winelands. In other words, the Rabshakeh attempts to replace the established interpretative framework founded on God's conventional promises with a toxic interpretative frame that the Assyrian king is the new provider and sustainer of Judah in exchange of Judah's loyalty to the Assyrian king. After the divine response, there is a crisis among the Assyrians and there is a proper reply by God. At the end, I would like to conclude that the presentation so far demonstrates that the strategies of the Rabshakeh and Sennacherib's letter were not successful in shattering the existing explanatory framework of King Hezekiah, his servants, Prophet Isaiah, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. It did not succeed because they accepted the leading thoughts and the re-establishing of the proper narrative by the prophecy of the prophet. The recovery strategy demonstrated in the oracles of Prophet Isaiah thus serve as more preventive rather than strategy of recovery. Thus, it might be concluded that the trauma reading makes it clear that a more profound traumatic experience does not take place in these chapters, because the major elements of trauma have not been encountered. At best, the attempts of the rupture candidate of Sennacherib do not result in a prolonged state of trauma for the king of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem.